Now we need to actually attempt to desolder the connection for the pin, which is positioned at this point on the other side of the board. Don't attempt to try and do it from the other side. This you should be able to do quite easily. Just going to arm my trusty sucker to make sure that I have a good area to work with. With my finger on the button of the sucker, I'm now going to heat the pin as quickly as I possibly can, having the sucker very close to the tip, and hopefully that should be enough to remove the solder. It hasn't quite worked. Always the same when you're trying to do something. There we are. I've managed to desolder the pin to make sure that there's no solder on the pin. If you have any excess solder that's near the pin, you can always just remove that small amount with the end of an X-Acto knife, just to make sure it's nice and clean round that hole. Well, I have found out by a little bit of experimentation that the easiest way to unsolder this joint is to actually try and do two things at the same time. It's like patting your head and rubbing your stomach at the same time. So what I've actually had to do is I've actually had to put my X-Acto knife very carefully behind the unit, very carefully. I do haste to add, because you will crack the board otherwise. I've now managed to get, as you can see, a small gap at the back of the board by pushing my X-Acto knife in, and at the same time, this is where you need 3 pairs of hands, heating up the solder joint to remove the pin. And you will feel the pin will remove to the point whereby it is nearly through the board. So effectively I've now increased the gap quite considerably down the back of the module, as you can see. Excuse my shakiness of the video, but I'm looking at the screen upside down. And hopefully, once I now heat this again, it should remove the module away from the board. The module isn't quite free. There's a little bit of glue that's holding it on this back edge. Now I can clearly see that the module is still actually soldered in place, and as you can see I've got a gap between the module now and the board, but the pin is still clearly attached to the board, so it still needs a little bit of desoldering. Now, being careful to remember the orientation of where the pin goes. Let's see if we can finally get this released away from the board. There you go. It is a bit of a job. It's not quite as straightforward as people can lead to believe. There's your self-adhesive ring on the back of the old module, and there's the old module clearly taken away. Now for the job of making sure that we can see through the hole in the module. So if you cannot see through that hole, you need to be able to clear the other side of solder in order to do so. I'm just running my soldering iron round that hole very carefully without putting too much heat on it, because you have a component that is very, very close to where the hole is there. So all I can say is be very, very careful of heating that module up. I've not put any heat into the circuit boards around this at all, so consequently there shouldn't hopefully be any damage. I would very strongly recommend that you make sure that that hole on both sides is completely clear of solder. And what I have done is I've actually, without taking off the double-sided tape, offered the pin up to the hole to make sure that the pin will go through the hole. There we go. So I have just basically dry offered up the module to the circuit board. As you can see, it doesn't quite line up with the old module, but as long as these screw holes are kept clear, you can orientate the module. It really has to go in that one position. It cannot really go in any other position, but the module is slightly off-centered in comparison to the old module here. So once you've dry assembled that, you can then remove the sticky tape from the back very carefully. And remembering exactly where you want it to go. Offer pin to the hole, line it up to miss the two screw holes here, and very gently push it in place. Now we're ready to resolder the joint in the centre there. And with the aid of my trusty soldering iron, make a nice neat joint with the new module in place there. Now that hopefully should complete your module with your Buzzcam module in place. Be very careful. This cable is still, even now, very, very sticky, as you can see. So we now need to refit this back into the quadcopter so that we can get all the shielding now back in place again. Well, a small problem that I've come across by putting this module on this board is that you do actually have to offset this to its original position. The reason being is because, as you can see, you have to keep these holes perfectly clear in order for the module to sit back inside the unit so that the screws will go back. So you must offset this when you position it. I've just had to unsolder this and reposition it, again by using the X-Acto knife to be very, very careful to remove it. It's a classic mistake that can be easily made, but you might as well know that the problem is that you have to keep these holes perfectly clear in order for the unit to sit comfortably over the pegs here, so that when you actually go back, the screw holes line up exactly. Now, this module being a lot thicker than the let me get it in focus to the right place, there we are. This module is obviously a lot thicker than the old module, so effectively there is a dramatic difference, if I can get the camera at the right angle, a dramatic difference of thickness. Now I would say that this circle here will impede the module going fully down. As you can see, you can actually move it around. Now before, these small upstands came through these holes, which they now do not do. So consequently, when you re-screw this back in again, you need to be very careful of not to put too much pressure onto the board. I think I may trim down this circle here to allow me to have the freedom in the top of the module. I'll keep you posted. Now I've just temporarily screwed the module back in to its position, and I have left purposely the board, as you can probably see, quite loose at this present moment in time, because what you now need to do is tighten these screws up just enough, literally without bending the board. Tighten them up just enough to grip the board so that it doesn't move or bend. Still need a fraction more. So that the board is nice and secure. But do not over tighten these screws, as the unit underneath is a lot thicker and you will bend or possibly break this board if you screw it hard down into the base. Now we're actually going to put the shielding back into the top of the unit, remembering of course that this lead now needs to come directly out the back to be able to connect onto the Phantom main board. So I'm going to bend these wires very carefully down, and then we need to pass the shield back through so that it can be repositioned. I'm actually going to reuse the original backboard that came with the Phantom, making sure that it's obviously very square, and push it back as best as possible to its original position, so that the module is nice and secure. the moulding goes back pretty fairly much as it was. Now that connection needs to come out of the back so that it faces the back from where the two stickers are. Well, I have decided that I'm going to hedge my bets that this shielding is pretty good, and I'm going to attempt to reuse the original shielding that was taken out, remembering to make sure that your cable is laying over the back. There is a small nick where the cable should come out. It's a bit fiddly because of the fact that it's very sticky, obviously. Let's zoom out so you can get a better perspective. I think I've got it pretty much lined up to how it was originally. I'm actually pushing down round the centre module first before I push it in place down the arms. That's gone pretty well back to where it was originally. With a little bit of teasing of the fingers, you should be able to get rid of most of the ripples from the original. Make sure, of course, you keep your vents here free of any obstructions to allow any excess heat inside to ventilate out of the quadcopter, and that lead is pretty much at the back as best as I can get it. And of course now we can, if you so wish, put in the black ops reflector, which I hope will improve the reflective signal inside. That lays pretty well in there. And that basically is the module all fitted in place, ready to go back on the quadcopter, remembering that your connection here has to be made. So now we can bring our famous phantom back into place. I've put the front facing you so that I know exactly where the plug goes, and remember that this plug, make sure that you connect the plug into the socket properly before you actually lay the lid back on the top again. It's a little bit fiddly because the lead is now markedly shorter, I'm just going to double check the connection at the back is in place, and as you can see, the connection is back in place at that point where it connects onto the main board, and I can now safely. There is obviously, because of the black ops, it does restrict it a little bit at the top. I found that there is quite a bit of restriction, as the Wi-Fi pad interrupts me, quite a bit of restriction with the top, whereby you have to put a reasonable amount of force to get that lid to close properly. The advice that Buzzcam give you is to heat the pad with a hairdryer just to warm it up, and you should be able then to mould that pad much better in shape. That's something that I'm now going to actually do to see if I can improve. Well, here we are after fitting the module to the Phantom, just sitting there, and placing it in exactly the same position. We are getting 7 satellites. I did get 8 a few seconds ago before I switched the camera on, but 7 seemed to be the magical number. So it really hasn't, at this present moment in time, altered the amount of satellites that I can receive in exactly the same position. But obviously time will tell whether this is effectively a problem. So effectively, I have carried out the fitting of this unit exactly as I believe it should have been carried out. I've just tried connecting here inside my house and I still can't get a signal, which is not surprising with all the steel that's involved in my house. But my first conclusions are that at this moment in time it hasn't made a dramatic change to the way that the sat-nav signal is picked up from the GPS satellites. I shouldn't say sat-nav because it's not a sat-nav, it's a GPS signal. So my conclusions are at this moment in time that the Black Ops hasn't worked particularly well for me, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not going to work particularly well for you. I fitted it exactly as required. There is the old module which I took out of my original Phantom, and I hope that you fit yours with the same care and dedication that I have, and failing mistakes, you shouldn't find fitting it a massive problem. But all I can say is it's certainly not a job for the faint-hearted to be taken out. If you're competent and you feel happy about soldering, desoldering, about potentially causing a little potential damage that you could do, and all I will say is that great care is needed when fitting this module. It's not as straightforward as it may seem. So that's all I can say from the kitchen table. So I'm going to have a well-deserved cup of tea. I haven't got a Simon mug, unfortunately, but cheers everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the video.